Hello and welcome everybody to this webinar together with Autogram and dotCMS. My name is Preston So. I use he, him, they, them pronouns. And today I'm joined by two very dear and longtime friends of mine, Jeff Eaton and Karen McGrane. We're going to be talking today about a lot of stuff that's happening in the CMS world and the content strategy landscape, especially around page builders, content observability, and the Universal CMS. I'll go ahead and introduce myself first. My name is Preston So. As I mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Product here at dotCMS, and I work on product things and product stuff, lots of fun things around the content management system world. I've been in the software landscape for about 20, 25 years, and I have 17 years of experience in the content technology world. And I've spent about the past 9 years serving product teams and product functions at a variety of different organizations. And I'm here at dotCMS now, and also the, I guess, coiner of the term Universal CMS here at the CMS industry. And I'm joined by two very dear friends of mine. I'm going to, hand the mic over to them as well. I'm first joined by my dear friend Karen McGrane, who I've known for a long time. Karen has been in the web world for 20, 25 years as well, maybe even longer, I think, actually, and is the author of two books that are perennial presences on my desk, Content Strategy for Mobile and Going Responsive. Jeff Eaton is also a very dear friend of mine. We've known each other for decades at this point, I think. Jeff has been with the sort of web and CMS landscape ever since tables first came on the scene, has been a CMS expert for many, many years, and also has the same number of years in the CMS and web landscape. And both Karen and Jeff are partners at Autogram. So, hey, Jeff, hey, Karen, how you both doing today? And would you like to share a bit about yourselves?
Sounds fantastic. It's great to be here chatting. Karen, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, be happy to. So I'm really happy to be here. As you mentioned, I have been doing content strategy, information architecture, structured content, semantic metadata work for my whole career, actually. And I've spent a long time keeping abreast of the kinds of changes that are happening in the CMS landscape. And it's always been a pleasure to get to talk to smart folks like Preston and Jeff about what guys like you are seeing in what happens on the back end, what happens on the author experience, what happens on the front end. We've witnessed a lot of change happening in the last decade or so with the shift to headless and now the Universal CMS. So I'm really looking forward to getting a chance to talk about how those technologies affect organizations and their ability to deliver ROI on their content.
I appreciate the storied introduction. When I started out in the pre-web days, I thought I was going to be going into journalism. That's what I wanted to do, and so first you get work for with a marketing agency, and you start working there, and stuff like that, and then suddenly you start building home pages. And over time, that becomes pretty much all this marketing agency does. And you realize, hey, I'm running the server, and I'm actually starting to use databases, and I'm doing a lot of crazy stuff. And then you sort of come out of a fugue, and you're like doing enterprise data modeling and stuff like that. So, I followed a very circuitous course, but like since the very, very earliest days, that's been a big part of what I was doing. And for probably the last, like 15 pushing 20 years or so, I've been focusing really exclusively on digital CMS work and all of the tangles that come along with that, the content architecture, the workflow, the production, the interaction with the front end and design and the different endpoints and stuff like that. But I guess I don't think of myself as a CMS person, but when I look back over the years, I'm definitely a CMS guy now that I think about it. But yeah, Preston, we crossed paths early on in the Drupal world back when I was working with Lullabot, and we've crossed paths through some of the wildest days of the Drupal era too. So it's great to be chatting again.
Absolutely. And it's always a pleasure, whether we're being recorded or not, to be having chats with you both. As always, a pleasure. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So I think that we've talked quite a bit, the three of us, about some of the inherent biases or, let's say, risks that lie in what are traditionally known as, or what are sort of universally known as, page builders. Obviously, all three of us grew up in the static website era where page builders were really rooted in that static sort of website mentality. And I think I wanted to get, first of all, I wanted to ask, what do you both see as some of the biggest issues and problems around page builders today, with a specific eye on two aspects? One thing I think is that bias that we see towards the static website, the fact that oftentimes these page builders end up encoding some of these biases and leaking abstractions of the static website into the editorial experience. But also, I think more generally, from the standpoint of structured content as well, and the quote unquote right way to drive content, which is obviously independent of and decoupled from and completely let's say untied to or unlinked to visual structures or strictures like the sort of web page. So let's start there. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on page builders writ large and where are the problems.
And I've talked a lot about, and historically, about that page metaphor and how inadequate it is for doing truly digital content. Like we as people, as human beings, are so attached to the concept of the first thing you do is you describe the container, and then you describe what's going to go into the container, and what you create is is essentially locked to that container. And I think it's a testament to how compelling that metaphor is that we manage to keep rebuilding that metaphor over and over and over again every time we try to advance the new technology. And we sit here now in 2024 in a space where we have not just web pages, but truly multi-platform, omni-channel publishing. We have AI on the scene. I don't think we're allowed to do a webinar without mentioning AI, so I figure I'll just get that out of the way right now. We have all sorts of scenarios where having that kind of semantic metadata attached to content that will allow it to be flexible and allow it to be reused in different ways is necessary. And yet, people still want a page builder. They're begging for page builders. They're saying, like, please just let me have the WYSIWYG tools that I'm looking for. And so I think that's kind of where we're perennially at, is sort of trying to strike the right balance between how do we make sure we have the semantic metadata that we need, the structures that we need, but how do we also ensure that when people demand a page builder and we recognize that a page builder is necessary, we can do that in a way that's sustainable.
I think it's interesting, Preston, that you mentioned the history of how the concept of visual page building is really rooted in the days of I'm making a home page and pulling out Notepad or Go Live or Hot Dog. I'll just date myself and rattle off names of ancient, Dreamweaver. Everybody remembers Dreamweaver. But that idea of okay, you go in and you just make all this markup and you make a page, and it's this sort of fixed artifact that reflects how you wanted it to look. And, in the early days, you faced stuff like, oh, well, it looks different on different browsers. And then we started thinking about, oh my gosh, different viewports and, different devices. And you got this blossoming explosion of all the different places a page can live. And that made things tremendously complicated. But I think what's interesting is that between that shift to a totally agnostic universal world where content goes everywhere, between we make static HTML files and we make content that flows everywhere, there was this period where the current generation of CMSs that are dominant grew up, where the benefit you got from using a tool that used structured data, maybe you were doing single sourcing if you were like a huge corporation that was printing doing their manuals or something like that. But the big benefit was like, we've got a ton of different pieces of content, and keeping them in the same style and the same templates or changing the design is just a huge hassle. So you use a CMS to say like, okay, we're going to have a title, and we're going to have an author bio, and we're going to have a body field, and we're going to chop those things up like the classic blogging content model. Everybody knows those core fields. There's like, categories, primary image, stuff like that. And that allowed people to get out of the I'm just constantly slinging HTML markup all the time when I want to publish a post or an update or a piece of news. And then you got like, oh, well, now we've got different kinds of content. Some systems just said, hey, whatever, do what you want to in the body field, knock yourselves out. Other systems allowed you to define different types of things, that you got different forms to enter different kinds of fields in. And I think like that world of structured content really dominates, even if it's not what people currently think about. I think it dominates like the history and the inertia of the current content management landscape. And the challenge is that a lot of marketing teams and groups that have to actually produce very different things very frequently, and they may be building out a custom marketing campaign that's only really going to be active for a few months, or they may be promoting an event with a cluster of different pieces of content that need to go into different places. And on the one hand, it's a hassle building all of that stuff by hand with like HTML tools and stuff like that. On the other hand, it's just as much of a hassle in the vast majority of like large scale CMSs that, organizations are using to do anything that really breaks the mold. Like the work of modeling out structured content for all the different kinds of things you need takes time. And there's usually developers involved, and there's designers, and there's testing, and you roll out these changes. And like the value is that, but once we've done that, we get to use this a million times. We're going to be able to make a billion of these pages if we need to, and they all follow this new pattern we've set out. Unless you're probably only really going to do an event like this once, and you don't, maybe you're trying a new type of marketing campaign. It's like that weird middle zone that folks find them in, where they live in an ecosystem where tons of content's being produced. It's got to go to a bunch of different places. And also they need to be able to do novel, different stuff, ways of presenting things, new types of media being integrated, or just, whatever, just new approaches. They need to be able to try those things out and iterate them. That classic, well, you design your content model and you do it in CMS, and then you roll out the new version of your CMS, and then you produce it. It's really tough because you don't have that promise that when we invest X and then we get to amortize it forever. So I think there's this really weird tug of war zone that we're in, and page builders tend to thrive right there in that spot where like an organization's like, oh man, who can even say what we, what we'll need? Well, we can describe 80% of our stuff to you, but 20% of it is just, man, people are just coming up with things, all the time, and we just need to be able to do special stuff. And that's where I think it gets tricky.
Absolutely, Jeff. And I think, one thing you raised is really interesting to me, because I've seen, everything you've raised is really interesting to me, but I want to call out one piece in particular, which is, you mentioned that there's a pretty wide range of possible outlays of content that organizations want to do. A lot of them are things that are very boilerplate, that adhere to a certain standard, that are, things like, basically the same landing page over and over again, or
you don't want to innovate with your privacy policy page.
Exactly. Yeah, the privacy policy page. If you have an accessibility policy page, which everyone should, by the way, those sorts of things obviously are relatively evergreen, but it's that gray area. And I find in my past experience, especially working with organizations that are doing experimental things with their content, right? People who are, for example, building voice interfaces to serve content. There's a big danger, and obviously I think this is one of the reasons why we saw so many people arguing, for decades now about centralizing content in a single source of truth, is you end up with content silos, you end up with content marooned on an island somewhere where you can't find it ever again, and it just is totally, it's this like, the sort of analogy I see, the sort of analogous type I would see of this sort of thing happening in a page builder environment is you have a single page template that is used for one page only and then is never used again anywhere, right? And that content also is only destined for that single page template. So I think we've covered a lot of the history here. I'm curious about this, though. One thing that we've seen a bit recently, and I do want to get back to your point about, sort of making an investment and it's, and its amortization, of course. But the thing I wanted to ask you both about first and foremost is lately we're seeing a convergence between the headless or composable CMSs and the old established legacy CMSs or monolithic or hybrid headless CMSs. I think one of the things that I've learned as a product person over many years is that once you hand somebody a feature that they really like, and this is the page builder, right? It is very, very difficult to take that toy away, right? And to argue that no, you should really maybe be using this tool later in the process, or maybe not even at all. Right? I'm curious because obviously I've been tracking this new trend or sort of evolution towards a new state of the CMS called the Universal CMS. And what we're seeing in that is that the feature sets, especially with regard to page builders, are beginning to significantly overlap between the headless and composable CMSs and the hybrid headless and monolithic CMSs. But wasn't the goal of headless and composable and all of that to kind of move away from the page builder mindset? I'm curious, have headless and composable CMSs, are they exacerbating some of these issues around page builders that you both shared, or what are your thoughts there?
I mean, my take on it is I wouldn't say they're exacerbating the issue, but they may be highlighting the issue in a different way from the way monolithic CMSs do. I'm fond of saying that, like, for every strategy you employ, there will be benefits and downsides, right? Like, I've talked to organizations about their organizational structure, and it's like, well, do you want to have a centralized design team or a decentralized design team? And both of those approaches have upsides and downsides. You have to be able to manage the downsides. And so I think we've gone through what many of the downsides are to strictly page builder monolithic approach. When you swing the pendulum the other way and go towards a headless or decoupled approach, you're going to have different downsides. And you're going to be more acutely aware of some of the pain points for that strategy. I guess I've never really met an organization that didn't need to have some combination of both. And I think that's really where we're at today, or I think where we're at with the Universal CMS is recognizing that for pretty much every organization, they're going to have some types of pages that are very structured and lend themselves well to having that kind of headless approach where they're producing them and they're pretty templated. And then they're going to have other types of pages that are more one-offs, and they're maybe more designed, and they may be things that don't necessarily need all of the overhead of coming up with a content model and coming up with the templating structure and the author experience to support that. And so I really think we're at a point where too much of that decision has been foisted off on clients who are essentially handed their tooling and then said, well, you're going to have to figure out how you want to use it. Do you want to build that or not? We don't know. And honestly, I really think that there's a huge benefit to organizations to, shall I say, hire firms like Autogram to help them with their planning process. But I definitely think that CMS product vendors should have a stronger point of view on how do you use the headless capabilities of our tool? When is it appropriate to use a page builder tool? And how do we make sure that those things work together?
Yeah. I think one of this is actually something that's come up a lot in talking with clients and vendors. Is it's very rare to find an organization that can really effectively articulate like what their product's perspective on content is. Like, what is its take on how things fit together? What kinds of things are there that can fit together? Like in the Drupal world, there were blocks and views and node types and users, and there were certain kinds of primitives that a site gets put together out of, and that comes with a certain kind of perspective on like how you put these things together. Sometimes they have different primitives or different names for them or different ways of clicking them together or a different sort of mental model. I think the first really strong wave of headless CMSs tried to dial a lot of that back, because historically there had been so much frustration with like deeply baked in, decade old decisions about those kinds of mental models. And devs it was an era where there was a lot of pushing the limits on that, and the front end tooling was changing rapidly. Things were crazy, and everyone was really frustrated with a lot of those old school sort of systems that had a strict way of thinking about things. And I think a lot of the biggest headless players, their reaction was to sort of dial it that back and almost say like, hey, we're a spicy content optimized database. We're not making pages. We're not doing any of this stuff. We store your content. That's that. But what that also means is that, as Karen said, clients, the people who are actually who need a website or are trying to produce, web content or digital content or multi-channel content day in and day out, they kind of have to go back to ground zero and reinvent, well, how do we do a landing page? How do we do editorially curated collections of things that have some special content and some stuff that's rule-based? How do we do localization of content where some of it's translated and some of it's written from scratch? The benefit to a lot of people for a monolithic CMS is a lot of those decisions have already been made. If you like the decisions that have been made, there is a ton of work that's already done for you. You don't have to go in and like start assembling things and clicking things together and make sure everything works and make sure you've built out your edit screens so that they take all these things into account. Like, that's the heavy lifting that the monolithic system has done for you. I think that tension between spicy content optimized database and you make your decision and you get the all encompassing, here's the way the CMS does it, you can't really change it. The idea of those two extremes, I think, really got anchored there. And what you're talking about, like, I think what you're describing as the concept of the Universal CMS is the slow growth of those things, sort of recognizing the strengths on the other side of the fence. And, over time, headless CMS vendors have realized, at the end of the day, people still got to assemble stuff that will be presented visually. So we need page builder tools or things like that. And on the side of the classic CMSs, there's been a lot of realization that, man, our content isn't just being piped to web pages that we render anymore. We need to have APIs that this stuff is going to be able to go out to. We need to be able to tease apart like the HTML-ness of the stuff that we're doing so that it can be translated into multiple forms. And it feels like now the landscape, like the product categories are really strict, but there's increasingly like they're back to bumping in against each other, where you can take a classic monolithic CMS in most cases and use it as a repository for multi-channel device independent content. And, you can slap a, view front end on top of, a headless CMS, and all you're ever making is web pages with it. You're not trying to do all the, wild stuff. You're just making web pages. And that overlap is interesting. And I think like it's it's not the marketing categories that are talked about. It's discussed as if it's like this, strict boundary, but there's a lot of growth into that middle zone. I think it's interesting because I've seen lots of terms like, hybrid headless and stuff like that have gone around. I think your coining of the Universal CMS has been an interesting attempt to like really zero in on that, if I understand it correctly.
Absolutely. And, definitely what's really interesting about this whole idea is that actually Dean Barker over at Optimizely had been talking about this as well in parallel. We had, even though he and I are in touch all the time, he and I had never actually talked about this. He calls it a race to the middle, because I think we can all agree that, pure headless and pure monolithic CMSs are starting to become a thing of the past. A lot of these CMSs are now increasingly inflicting a lot of their opinions on the presentation layer, on the visual side. A lot of the hybrid headless or monolithic players are really good with SDKs and APIs now for developers. The comparison I like to make historically is that, it's very much like Karen said earlier, it's a pendulum swing back in the direction of democratization for the marketing teams and content teams that feel that they've had power taken away from them, just like developers felt that they had power taken away from them by having to work in the confines of some of these, I wouldn't say very antiquated, but certainly, let's say, restrictive languages or templating languages that were oftentimes very opinionated, very strict about what they could do, and very prescriptive as well. Universal JavaScript is the historical sort of the historical analog I always use to talk about Universal CMS, because Universal JavaScript was a way for developers to kind of regain control over something that was being perceived as increasingly fossilized, namely jQuery, DHTML, Ajax, those sorts of interactions. And now we're seeing the same thing with content teams and marketers saying, we need to be able to have a separation of concerns that makes sense for us and isn't just something that is, about architectural prescriptivism or architectural purity. So there's an interesting, I think, side line to this, though, and I want to come back to Universal CMS in a little bit, because I do see it as sort of where the CMS in general is headed as a software category. But, I wanted to call out a couple of interesting things that I've heard recently. As we know, investments in content technologies and content people in general as well, if we look at, just what's happening in the content design world, we look at what's happening in the content strategy space as well, we look at conferences shutting down as well, it's clear that a lot of businesses are seeing content as potentially not an investment that they want to keep pumping money into. We've heard also that, DXP, the digital experience platform category, people are starting to move a little bit away from that. Marketing budgets are going down as well. So I want to go back to something you said earlier, Jeff, which is, how do we help content teams and people who are touching page builders, touching these, both the common content, right, and the, let's say special content, right, the sort of one-off landing pages. I want to dig into sort of your and Karen's opinions around how we can better justify a lot of these business decisions and outcomes that people are looking for.
I tend to think that the genuinely one-off stuff, like the home page is always the easy example, is fairly easy to justify an investment in, because most websites, they don't have too many of those genuinely one-off things. And then there's like the big footprint of relatively templated stuff that it follows some straightforward and predictable paths, and you can maybe customize it by, making some choices, or, putting a special hero image in or whatever, and, the templates can sort it out. But that middle zone of when, like, well, the things that you need to do that are special start becoming more and more frequent and more common, and you sort of look up and you realize, 20% of our site by volume is special pages that we've gone in and tweaked and customized. Those are the situations where it feels like page builders have become they become load-bearing tools in most organizations, because they don't know how they would get the developer and design and infrastructure resources to actually build all of that stuff one-off. But They can't do it with the heavily templated stuff. So like something's gotta fill that gap, and the page builders, they live there. And I think the biggest challenge that we've seen is in organizations that have been doing that for a long time, like, well, several years, let's say. You mentioned that, it's real hard to pry something out of people's hands once they've used it, and once they say, oh, okay, this will actually let me do this thing that I have to do, I'll use this. We've seen this trend where more and more and more and more of the content on a site starts getting built with the page builders, and suddenly, it's almost like the better the page builder is at allowing people to just make something special or unique, the less effective the structured content model that was built out is at actually establishing what's there and what can be expected and what stuff can be reused. And it sort of turns into this like dark zone of content that nobody really knows what it's doing. Nobody really knows what it's made of. They just know, well, that was last year for such and such campaign. I'm not sure what really is in that section, but it's there. And like, that's the place where we found that it's trickiest, because just making the page builder tool better isn't solving that issue, unless this like deeper question of how do you bring those worlds together, the structured, semantic meaning and the complexity of assembly. That's the kind of stuff that Karen's been talking about since like people were doing it just in a body field with Dreamweaver copying and pasting.
Well, it was before Dreamweaver even. That may be like belying my bias here, but I do believe there's hope for having more semantic metadata in place that will help us solve this problem. Jeff is fond of calling them mystery meat pages, right? Like you have something that's built with a page builder, but you don't have any way of actually knowing what it is or why it existed, or even when you try to query it, when they try to do a crawl and analyze what that page is, you don't know why it was created. You don't know what type of page it was supposed to have been. All you can tell is like, well, you have a hero, and then you've got some text, and then, you've got maybe a quote, and then you got another weird hero. So I think for organizations, having the discipline in place to say, yes, we are going to need a page builder, but in order to make that effective over the long term, we also have to have some processes in place for us to capture what was the author's intent or the business's intent when they created that page. How are we going to track the purpose of the page? Why was it created? When was it created? Is this a campaign landing page? Great. We're going to treat it very differently than we're going to treat the privacy policy page, or a page that was created solely for legal purposes. So that's one of the things that Jeff and I at Autogram have been talking with a lot of our clients about, is how do you build that observability into your system, so that when you do your next replatforming, or for when you have to make some decisions about a migration, or you realize you have 100,000 pages on your website and you don't know what any of them are, you will have a way to make decisions about that content, and in fact know if that content's doing anything for you.
Absolutely. And I think content observability is obviously one of those things that is so crucial in today's very uncertain business landscape. I think a lot of folks are seeing now that in the post ZERP world, they have to very much think about how they justify their work and their jobs and all of those things. So it's a very challenging time for a lot of, I would say, CMOs and content leads at most organizations right now. What I will share very quickly is these are the types of problems that we're beginning to solve at dotCMS, and at that sort of very granular, very deep level, at the schema level, even to really understand exactly how content is used, how it's how it can be sort of recorded in terms of data that can then be observable in ways that can be tracked over time. And I know that we've been talking about observability as well quite a bit between the three of us. Digging into content observability a little more and digging into sort of Universal CMS to sort of bring these two things together. I think one of the things I've noticed, and I'm not sure if you both agree with this potentially blanket and lukewarm or overly warm statement here, but when you talk about content observability, right? When you talk about the ability to really deeply understand content at that structured level and also approach it from a pageless or an unbiased perspective that is not, let's say, misled by a page builder, which is where, as we agree, a lot of people start their content production. Isn't it true, though, that sort of headless and composable CMSs, by their very nature, because of the fact that, there is, especially the pure headless CMSs, right? Because there's no sort of connectivity or conduit that's very clear that leads back to some of these metrics or some of these UIs or dashboards within the headless CMS. This is something that requires a lot of developer time. And so I'm curious, if we think about CMS architectures, how do you both see content observability playing out in the CMS landscape? Is it even something that's appropriate for the CMS?
So that's a very interesting point, because I think one of the challenges is that the stuff that analytics and metrics teams are trying to measure, is this piece of content doing the work that it ought to do? On the one level, you've got like a whole world of challenges of like what should we actually be measuring? It's visits, engagement, where, conversions. Well, who knows? What's the page supposed to be doing? That's sort of the heart of the observability question that we've been talking about. Like, what's the page's intent? Your site search page shouldn't be expected to convert users. It should be expected to get people to something as quickly and efficiently and effectively as possible. And the conversion pages you've set up for your products, by the same means, you don't necessarily want people sitting on them for 6 minutes at a time and reading 20 other pages and all kinds of good engagement metrics. What you want is for them to actually do a particular thing on that conversion page. And the idea that different things serve different needs and you're going to be measuring different outcomes for each of them is really critical. And that comes back to the thing you said about, in the days of, zero interest rates and free flowing investment money, and, here, have a cloud-based solution for free for the first 2 years, and, all that world of like, just everything's out there. Make content, see what happens. There's more expectation that the actual effectiveness of the content is going to be demonstrable. But then you have to say, well, okay, well, what's it supposed to be doing? How do we measure that? And more often than not, the thing being measured is happening at the end point of some engagement. It's on an app, in a web page, the fact that an RSS reader, pulled the latest version of the feed. All sorts of different things are going on there that aren't necessarily just about the atomic piece of content sitting in a content repository. And I think that makes it very tricky for a product that's committed to a pure headless approach to get integrated with that stuff. And, what are you measuring? We're measuring HTML pages getting looked at. And who knows how that correlates to your content model on the back end. That's something that the React dev figured out. So, what that means, does that mean the React developer is basically your core business integrator? I don't know. Like, that's a tricky one. So like, there's those two parts of it, figuring out what that intention is, and then understanding where all that has to get measured and having a plan for how that rolls back.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I definitely want to hear Karen's thoughts on this as well. There's one thing that you said just now that I think was really interesting, which is, just as we're seeing, we're the expectation now increasingly, right, with the headless and composable decoupled architectures is, you just have a, engineering team over here that can help you connect the dots, right? That can help you, basically measure each step of a content pieces journey or a content items journey, and measure ROI well before, right, it gets to that that actual delivery endpoint. But what we're seeing is that, a lot of people, just like we're seeing, lower investments from businesses in marketing functions, we're also seeing lower investments from business in new website builds or new CMS builds, replatforms, and also in developer teams writ large. And so, we know that a lot of folks simply don't have the luxury or the privilege of hiring a React developer team to build some of these workflows for them because they consider it to be internal tooling or things that should be built into the product to begin with. So, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this notion of content observability is that, Jeff and Karen, you both mentioned that this has to be something that's device independent. It has to be omni-channel, right? It has to be something that can operate and help content writers and copywriters and content specialists and content practitioners understand how their content is performing and the value it provides, regardless, not only of where it ends up, but also where those divides and dichotomies occur within the content production or content, let's say, creation process. Because, for example, if you think about the pure distinction between spoken content versus written content, right? I wrote a book about spoken content, voice content. That has to be a decision about how you structure that content and exactly what goals you're trying to achieve. That gets made well before it ever gets to any sort of previewable or presentation layer or rendered layer. And this is where I think the Universal CMS paradigm is really where we're seeing these two CMS market segments end up, because we're seeing, first of all, that marketing teams and content teams are saying, look, we can't have the visibility that we used to have. And we have all of these different channels now that we have to cover, not just the JavaScript ones, not just React and Angular and Vue.js and Next.js, but also all of these things that are where content needs to go today, including AI. Okay, there's two mentions now. We're okay with the hype curve here. But, as content goes to these places, there has to be not just that sort of back-end focus or that sort of, database only or repository only focus, but, it's something that reminds me of what Philip Rakowski of Alakai said, right? Which is what people are looking for today is not just a tool that helps you do one thing well when it comes to content and commerce systems. They're looking for ways to track and also execute on value from the very conception of that piece of content and the structure that surrounds that content all the way out to its delivery. It's no longer enough to measure just that final state. So, with this kind of idea of, relying less on developers, getting to a sort of restored, democratized state of the CMS in terms of this multi-channel, pageless focus, how do you see content observability evolving? And maybe this is a question for Karen. How do you see content observability figuring in sort of, let's say, the next few years? How important does it become?
Well, I am hopeful that in a post-ZIRP environment where delivering ROI and I think evaluating the cost of content and the costs of maintaining content that may not be providing value becomes ever more important, that more and more organizations will realize that the observability and the analytics piece is a crucial part of their overall CMS replatforming decisions. I mean, nobody wants to replatform their CMS, right? Like no one does that for fun. People do it because the current platform is end of life, or they do it because they have a system that's too expensive and it's not delivering the value that they want to get from it. And I think that for any organization that is planning to do something like that, like they're going to go through a whole vendor analysis and they're going to go through a migration and possibly have to go through a redesign, the opportunity there to say, we're going to be spending a bunch of money on this, we need to build appropriate feedback loops into our system where we are actively tracking and measuring the purpose of the content, the intent of the content. We are tracking that process all the way through. Like, it's not just something that happens after it goes live, but we have to be looking at the amount of time and resources it takes for us to create that content. I, in many cases, see organizations who, while there's enthusiasm for what I hear described as self-serve, like let's let the marketing team do their own thing, what that often winds up meaning is that developer resources are treated as too expensive. And so they would much rather have it's like, well, let's make the process for the content and the design people incredibly painful and take 12 weeks to make a web page because we don't want to get developers involved. Well, guess what? Like, that's also expensive and time consuming and very slow. So that, that feedback loop has to start from the content creation, and then it has to be something that you can track and measure. What did we want this content to do? And did it actually do that for us? How are we going to know? And then based on that information, how do we feed that back into our process so that we're refining the systems and refining the human parts of the process so that we can actually be more effective?
Wow. I mean, I see this, by the way, as being, let's say, a very key purchase that people will make, both in terms of services, and obviously Autogram is leading the way in terms of these sorts of concerns, but also in terms of products that are being built. I mean, apart from maybe a tool like Full Story, which doesn't, kind of plays in this space a little bit, kind of, but not really, there's not really a tool, I think, that exists out there that does really the full extent of what you're both describing here. And I'm very excited to dig into it more at a future time because we are running out of time. But Jeff, I'll let you take the last word here.
We sort of touched on these two topics, the idea of page builders and the need for flexibility and the need for people to be able to build stuff out without having to pull in a full development and design team to, for as part of the creation process for the CMS to actually have the tools to build novel and creative experiences. Talking about that alongside like observability can sometimes seem like an odd fit, but at least from our point of view, those two have to go together because like the biggest dangers and the biggest pitfalls of having those sort of flexible tools is the creation of these unmeasurable, who knows whether it should even still exist, mystery meat pages that you can't really look at, and they just sort of become this ever-growing, unmaintained, untended garden that it's there. Maybe when we do the next redesign, we'll toss them, but for now, who knows? And that's not only a difficult lift for long-term maintenance and testing and stuff like that, it also means that you're not learning from that. Like those calling like, oh, we did some experiments there. Well, an experiment implies gathering information so you understand more on the other side of it, not just throwing stuff at the wall and hoping that a year down the line, a particular user segment number is going to go up. Like figuring out what things can we look at on a shorter time frame? How can we determine whether or not that the signs we're seeing in our various metrics reflect what we think, what we expected this thing would do? If this were working the way we thought it would, we figured we'd see something like this happening. That kind of stuff is really essential in a world where content actually has to demonstrate its ROI to get continued ongoing value. Waiting for a year to determine whether or not a campaign worked or not from a content perspective just won't fly. And I think for that reason, like page building and dynamic construction of novel content has to end up going hand in hand with those kinds of information gathering tools in addition to the content creation tools.
Absolutely. I could not agree more with that last statement there, Jeff. And I think there's, this is one of the big reasons why I think content observability end to end is a key component and a key tenet of sort of this next stage of the CMS, Universal CMS, because there's two very interesting common things between these two ideas that I think are very compelling, right? The first is what Karen said just now around faster iterations, faster feedback loops, and also incorporating those insights in ways that I believe currently, I think personalization gets us a little bit of the way there. I think that, A/B testing gets us a little bit of the way there, but it's certainly not to the extent and certainly not upstream enough, right, to really do that kind of deep sort of thinking. And then the second thing is, just reducing the, let's say the sort of problems or bottlenecks that come up with content, not just when it comes to what you mentioned, Jeff, around the fact that, sometimes content is just ending up in a place with these mystery meat pages, but also the fact that you have to rely on developers for so many of not only the things that I mentioned around the page builder experience, but also around the actual, getting some of that data out and being able to act on those sorts of data points in a way that's holistically viewable and understandable across your entire content architecture. Well,
Yep.
this is all the time we have. We do have to stop at some point. I know we could go on all the way until midnight here, but where can people find you both? I mean, I know autogram.is obviously is where you can find Autogram, but Karen, Jeff, if there's something you want to plug, let people know how they can get in touch with you. Let's start with Jeff.
Man, the fall of Twitter has just absolutely destroyed my just talk to me there. I do actually hang out on LinkedIn, and and I post memes there these days. But yeah, it's LinkedIn, Mastodon increasingly, but that can be tricky to find stuff. But yeah, LinkedIn and LinkedIn or a website are probably the best place right now.
Yeah, I regret to inform you I have to be on LinkedIn now, and that's where you can find me. Yay.
Wonderful. Well, I am also on LinkedIn, and I am also off of Twitter. That's, linkedin.com/in/Preston So. You can also read my writing at preston.so/writing. You can also get in touch with me at preston.so/contact, and also learn more about our work at dotCMS over at dotCMS.com. Thank you all so much for listening to myself and Karen and Jeff perhaps bloviate a little bit, but hopefully we gave you some interesting things to think about. Last but not least, just a little quick note that August 5th, Monday, August 5th, is going to be our Universal CMS Summit event in Montreal, Canada. And you can find out more information about that at dotcms.com. We're very excited to learn more about your issues and things that you see being the future of the CMS in our landscape, and hope to see you all there in August in Montreal. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today. See you next time.